Meseches Beitzah Daf Chav Zayin concludes the discussion about muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos, if something can be muktzah for part of the day of Shabbos or Yom Tov. The Gemara will bring a final proof on that topic and then go back to our original discussion about judging a b'char's mum on Yom Tov. The Gemara will bring a story or two on the subject. The Gemara will attempt to conclude how we paskin in that, and then we'll get to our next Mishnah. The Mishnah will introduce for us the topic of muktzah as it pertains to an animal that dies on Yom Tov without shechita. We'll try to determine if that supports the Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Shimon's famous machlokas hilchos muktzah. Now we get to our last Mishnah about how people can get together and make a deal to buy an animal that they wish to slaughter. How is there a permitted way of doing that on Yom Tov? So first of all, let's begin. We're discussing the topic of muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. Our case is if somebody has an object which became a muktzah on Shabbos, and then that muktzah status ended. Do we say that it remains muktzah nevertheless for the rest of Shabbos? Now we know that if something is muktzah in the beginning of a Shabbos, and then that muktzah status, the thing that makes it muktzah ends, such as if he has grapes drying on the roof becoming raisins, and it's not edible while it's in between the grape and raisin situation, but then it gets fully dried, it still remains muktzah anyway. If in the beginning of a Shabbos it was muktzah, it stays muktzah for the entire Shabbos. The question here is, in the beginning of Shabbos it was not muktzah, then it became muktzah, does that continue to the rest of Shabbos, or does that end as soon as the actual thing keeping a muktzah ends? So the Gemara says we'll bring a proof. Somebody wants to cook pulim and adashim, beans and lentils. So there he cooks them on Yom Tov. You know, you're allowed to cook beans and lentils on Yom Tov, and you're allowed to eat them. So Rav Zera says, hold on a second, but while they are boiling in the pot, they are not edible, and therefore they're muktzah. You can't do anything with boiling hot beans and lentils. Now, before you boil them up, you could have technically chewed them up raw. That's possible. So they weren't muktzah. So at the beginning of Yom Tov, they weren't muktzah. Then when you put them in the pot to boil, they become muktzah, and as soon as the cooking's finished, you're allowed to eat them. So you see that it doesn't stay muktzah for the entire Shabbos. Says Abaye, according to that logic, how do you ever understand why you're allowed to have anything hot in the beginning of Shabbos? We keep things hot on the fire, or on coals, or on a blech, in the beginning moments of Shabbos. According to you, it's muktzah then, and then it should be muktzah the entire Shabbos, even when you take it off the fire. So obviously, you are not correct. There's a difference there, and the difference is that here it's called gamru bidei adam. It's in human capacity to take it out of its muktzah status. You can take it off the fire at any time and cool it off. And therefore, it's never muktzah because you do not mentally disengage from it. Muktzah means is that you mentally say that this object I can't use, nothing I can do with it. Well, here you can always take it off the fire, so you never disengage from it. Our question was about something which is real muktzah, which is when you can't control it. It's up to forces beyond your control. Like if you put grapes on the roof to dry out into raisins, that depends on the sunshine. So you can't control that, and therefore it's called Gamru B'dei Shemaim. That's the type of muktzah which we're asking should continue until after Shabbos is over, and we have not concluded that. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah we see in had a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, whether or not you're allowed to judge a mum on Shabbos. If a bechor gets a mum and you want to see whether it is a real mum or not, can you bring it? Can you determine that on Shabbos? According to Rabbi Yehuda, you can. According to Rabbi Shimon, you cannot, because that's like paskening a case. You are fixing the animal by determining its halacha on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, an incident here, the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya had a bechor in his house. He wanted to eat it, and he needed to have a mum on it in order to be able to shecht it. It was Yom Tov. Rashi says that he had kohanim in his house. You have to offer to kohanim first. He had kohanim in his house, and he sent the mum to Rav Ami to paskin whether it was a valid mum which made it mutter for him to shecht or not. And Rav Ami didn't want to paskin it on Yom Tov. And Rav Zvika, or possibly Rabbi Yirmiyah, said, "Why are you paskin halacha like Rav Shimon that you don't paskin mum in the Shabbos? Halacha should be like Rabbi Yehuda. We know the rule is always Rabbi Yehuda against Rav Shimon. Halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda." And the Gemara continues the story. He then sent it to Rav Yitzchak Nafka. He also didn't want to paskin it on Yom Tov. And Rav Yirmiyah, then again, possibly Rav Zrika, said again, the halacha should be like Rabbi Yehuda. We know the rule is always like Rabbi Yehuda. Should be allowed to paskin it. So the Gemara says, Rav Abba said to either Rav Yirmiyah or Rav Zrika, whoever it was, he said, why are you not allowing the Rabbanan here, which is Rav Ami and Rav Yitzchak Nafka, to go halacha like Rav Shimon, the paskening like Rav Shimon? Why are you interfering with that? So he said, why do you think that halacha is like Rav Shimon? Do you know something I don't know? So he said, yes, I heard Rav Zera say that the halacha is like Rav Shimon here. You're not allowed to pasken muman on Yom Tov. Now, somebody overheard the story. We don't know who it was. And he said, I want to go hear this psak from Rav Zeir himself. So when he got a chance, he went to Eretz Yisrael. And he asked Rav Zeir, did you paskin the halacha like Rav Shimon? He said, I did not paskin that way. However, I did say that it was logical. And there's two reasons. Number one is Rav Shimon is echoed in a Beitzah that says his opinion in the name of the Chachamim. That means we're saying the Chachamim, we are calling Rav Shimon's opinion the Chachamim. That means that this is the general approach of all the Chachamim, and that's usually how we usually only give that designation to something which is halacha l'maisa. The second thing is that we have a chain of Tanaim who seem to say that Rav Shimon's opinion lines up with Rabbi Meir's opinion. Then it would be Rabbi Shimon or Rabbi Meir against Rabbi Yehuda, in which case we would paskin like them against him. Where do you see that? So the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says that this is Tali Ba'ashli Ravavi, it's hanging on big ropes. Because Rav Shimon ben Pazi said in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, said in the name of Rabbi Yosef ben Sho, said in the name of Rebbe, said in the name of the Kahala Kadisha B'Yushalayim, the holy congregation of Yerushalayim, that Rav Shimon, halacha is like Rav Shimon because Rabbi Meir goes like him. So Gemara interrupts here and says, well, they said that Rav Meir goes like Rav Shimon. They were much older than Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon here is referring to Rav Shimon ben Manasseh, who quoted Rav Shimon ben Yochai's opinion. They were much older than him. Why would they say that the halacha was like someone who's younger than them? So the Gemara no, they weren't saying that. The halacha is like him. They were just noting that his opinion seems to line up with Rabbi Meir's. Anyway, what we're trying to get to here is that Rav Shimon's halacha, that you're now allowed to judge a mum on Shabbos, lines up with Rabbi Meir's opinion. What's this Rabbi Meir? The Gemara says Rabbi Meir says something about treifa. Treifa is an animal which has a wound which would make it non-kosher. So the halacha is that you're allowed to paskin on a treifus question after the slaughter. You can slaughter the animal first and then take a look at the carcass, analyze whatever injuries you find, and see is it treif or is it not treif. That you're allowed to do. However, what about a mum? If you shecht an animal that was kachim and you felt that it had a mum, you didn't show it to a chacham, you went ahead and you shechted it, can you paskin it afterwards? So that's a machlokes. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says yes. Rabbi Meir says no, you can't paskin it afterwards. So Gemara says, you see that Rabbi Meir holds that Bechor Mum is different than Treifus. Treifus you can paskin after the death, and Mumin you can only paskin while it's alive. Why? Why would that be? Because a Mumin is not just figuring out what the situation was. Mumin is an actual determination. You're creating a determined status of non-kachim. That's like a psak halacha. That's fixing it. That's really doing something. You're not just figuring out what the status was. You're actually creating the designation. That is why you can't do it on Yom Tov, because you're fixing it. You're creating the designation. You cannot do that on Yom Tov, and that lines up exactly with Reb Shimon's opinion. So Gemara says that Abaye wasn't too impressive. Abaye says, no, that's not really Pshat Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir didn't hold that you're creating the designation. That's not the thing. The thing was a kanas, which generally means a fine, a penalty of sorts. But the way the Gemara explains it, it's not really kanas, it's gzeira. Rishonim discussed, is there really a kanas involved here, or is it just gzeira? What's gzeira? So Rabbi Meir held as follows. There are certain types of movement which everybody agrees you can't check after shchita because the color changes or the way it looks changes. You won't be able to tell if it was a mum, or if it was a passing mum which does not make the animal non-kachim, or if it was a mum, a permanent mum which would count as a mum. What type of mum is this that you can't tell? That's a dukin shabayin, cataracts in the eye. You cannot judge after shchita. You have to judge them before shchita. So Rabbi Meir made gzeira from cataracts to all other types of wounds, even wounds which are clearly able to tell after shchita, like a broken leg or a ripped ear or something. All these things, he said that you should not judge those after shchita because you may end up judging a dukin shaba'ayin or something similar after shchita. Okay, but really it's nothing to do with him holding like Reb Shimon that there's a status that's created and therefore you couldn't do it on Yom Tov. And now the Gemara brings another incident. The Gemara says that somebody by the name of Ami Vardina was employed by the house of the Nasi, and his job was to paskin mumin on Becharim. They had a lot of Becharis there. And on Yom Tov, he did not paskin mumin. He did not want to determine the status of mumin on Yom Tov. So they came and told Rav Ami, not to be confused with Ami Vardina, they came and they told Rabbi Ami that Ami was not paskening mumin, and he said he's doing it correctly, because that's how he held was the halacha. So the Gemara says, is that true? But we know that there was an incident in which Rav Ami did pasken mumin on Yom Tov. The Gemara says, no, Rav Ami didn't determine if a mum was an actual mum or not on Yom Tov. He made that determination before Yom Tov, but sometimes he did not declare that it was a mum until Yom Tov itself. Why would that be? Because in order to determine that something is a mum, you not only have to check the mum, you also have to interview the owner and make sure he didn't make the mum on purpose. Because if he makes the mum on purpose, he's penalized and it doesn't count. The animal is not non-Bachar Kedusha anymore. Now that interview sometimes he didn't have time to do before Yom Tov, so he would save that until Yom Tov, and then he would actually give the final psak on Yom Tov. But that's not fixing the animal, because that's just he has to say the formula, but the actual determination was really made before Yom Tov. So Mary brings a similar story that happened with Rava. Somebody came to him on Erev Yom Tov, and he was busy washing his hair, and he wanted to ask him about a mum in his animal and his bachar. So he picked up his eyes and he looked at it, and he said, come back tomorrow. Came back tomorrow, he said, tell me how it happened. He said, well, the animal was on one side of a hedge of thorns, and there were some sa'irim, some barley on the other side, and he stuck his head through the hedge to get to it, and a thorn cut his lip. So Rava said, maybe you put the barley there on purpose, that he should stick his head through in order to hurt himself and get them home. So he said, no, I didn't do that, and possibly he proved that he didn't do it. And therefore he said, okay, that's all right. Now, the Gemara just comments on the story here. How Rava seems like he would not have accepted it had he set up the animal to hurt himself. How do you know that that's no good? We know you're not allowed to actually take a knife and cut the animal. That would not work. But if he just created a situation where he hurt himself, how do you know that that would be a problem? So the Gemara brings a Beitzah. Gemara says, the pasuk says, Kol mum lo yiyaba, you cannot yihayem a mum in it, you cannot create the mum. How do you know that you cannot cause a mum, such as with putting some food on the animal's ear, like figs or dough, so that a dog will bite his ear? How do you know you're not allowed to do that? Because it says kol mum lo yiyaba. The kol is to include a mum which you create in an indirect fashion. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah. Mishnah, after we've discussed different ways of turning animals into meat on Yom Tov that's permitted, we discussed shechita, we discussed shechita of a sick animal, now we discuss an animal that died on its own. So the Mishnah says an animal that died on its own is muktzah. You cannot do anything with it. You have to leave it alone. And there's a story that happened, and they came and they asked Rabbi Tarfon about an animal that died on its own on Yom Tov. They also asked about challah, that is the part you take off of the dough before you eat it, and you give it to a kohanim. Challah, which became tameh, you can't do anything with that either. They asked Rabbi Tarfon, what's the halacha with this animal that died and the challah that became tameh? Came to the Beis Medrash and asked, and they said, it's muktzah, you cannot move it. So Gemara says this seems to be a proof to Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Shimon, for the famous machlokes of Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about muktzah. Something which has one function, you change to another function, now has a new function. Does that make it muktzah? According to Rabbi Yehuda, it does. According to Rabbi Shimon, it does not. So here you see that this Stam Mishnah says like Rabbi Yehuda. That would seem to show that halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rabbi Shimon says that you would be able to. Now, what's their case that they're arguing about? They're arguing about cutting up a pumpkin in front of an animal and a dead animal in front of the dogs. So, according to Rabbi Shimon, you're allowed to do that because it counts as dog food. It's animal food, and even though it used to be people food, now it's animal food. When the animal was alive, it was human food because you could check that and eat it. After it died, it changed to dog food, but according to Rabbi Shimon, that does not make it muktzah. You should be able to eat it. This is a proof to Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. Could be that Rabbi Shimon agrees by a healthy animal that died on Yom Tov, that you had no idea that it was going to die at all, that would be muktzah. He only said that it's not muktzah in a case where the animal was sick and dying. You already thought of it as being dog food while it was alive. However, in a case where it was a completely perfectly healthy animal and it just dropped dead, then Rabbi Shimon would agree that that's muktzah, and that's what the case is over here. Now the Gemara says, okay, there's actually a machlokes amarayim if Rabbi Shimon agrees in that case or not. It's a machlokes between Mar Beider of Yosef and Mar Bar Ameimar, both in the name of Rava. So, according to Mar Bar Ameimar, the name of Rava, that Rabbi Shimon agrees in that case, you have a good answer. But according to Mar Beider of Yosef, that Rabbi Shimon does not agree, so you still have a kasha. So the Gemara says, I'll give you a different answer. Our Mishnah here is talking about a kudshim animal. This animal is kudshim. Kudshim you can't feed to your dog. And that's why this is muktzah, because there's really nothing you can do with it. I'm proof to you that we're talking about kudshim because it puts together challah and the animal that died. Challah is kudshim. The animal that died is also kudshim. Gemara said, if that's true, that it's kachim, so now we have a proof already the other way. Because you see that the only reason here why it's muktzah is because it's kachim and you can't feed it to your dog. That seems to indicate that had it not been kachim, it would not be muktzah because you could feed it to your dog. Now, that is a proof to Rav Shimon, and that, of course, only makes sense according to Mar Brei de Ameimar, not according to Mar Brei. That only makes sense according to Mar Brei de Rav Yosef, not according to Mar Brei de Ameimar, that Rav Shimon actually agrees in that case. Otherwise, it would not make sense, because if the Mishnah should not limit the case in which the animal is not muktzah to when it's the Mishnah should not limit the case in which the animal is muktzah to the case of kachim. It should say in all cases the animal is muktzah according to all opinions, according to Mar Bar Ameimar. So the Gemara says that he will understand that we're not talking about a healthy animal, we're talking about a misukenes, we're talking about an animal that was sick and dying, and that's why this animal was not muktzah here, and that even Rav Shimon would agree to that, because everybody holds that Rav Shimon would agree in a case where the animal was sick that it was not muktzah. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah. This discusses people who want to get together to buy an animal. Of course, in the days of Chazal, there was no refrigeration. You could not buy an animal unless all the meat was sold. So people wanted to get together and buy an animal together on Yom Tov, so there's a problem. You're not allowed to fix a price. You're not allowed to negotiate a price on Yom Tov. So what should you do? So the Mishnah says you cannot formulate a group to buy an animal on Yom Tov. Either you formulate the group and you negotiate the price before Yom Tov and you come to collect it on Yom Tov, or you shacht it and divide it up on Yom Tov and you'll discuss the price after Yom Tov. So the Gemara explains what exactly is the problem. The problem is fixing a price. You're not allowed to do that. So the Gemara says, how are you supposed to divide it up after Yom Tov? So the Gemara says you bring two animals and you determine that they have the same value. Slaughter one and give it out, and then after Yom Tov you can evaluate and come to a price on the one which remains alive, because you could use that to evaluate the actual price. Similarly, the Gemara says somebody wants to partake. He should not say, I'm going to take a sella's worth or 2 sella's worth. He has to say something along the lines of, I'll take a half, a third, or a quarter. That way he's not fixing a monetary value, and he's allowed to participate in that manner.